Hi, Erica. Thanks so much for joining me, friend.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I think this is worth telling a little bit of a story before we get started, which is we've been mutuals for I think a couple of years, peripherally, and at some point, I don't remember even how this happened, but you shared with me, or I saw a picture of your tattoo. And would you mind showing it real quick?
Oh yeah. Yeah, here I am.
There we go. But the greatest of these is love. And I'll ask you more about that later, but I was like, oh, I also have a love tattoo on my arm, and I think it sort of registered for me to, oh, I should meet this person. And we met in person, maybe a month, 5 weeks ago or something like that, and really hit it off. So I wanted to have you on the podcast. I'm really excited to dive into your world and how you see things and your life, and really privileged to have you here and to know you. Um, So yeah, I'll start by asking you the same question I ask everyone, which is right off the bat, a question that could be as hard as you want it to be or as easy as you want it to be, which is tell me about your life story, about the things that have happened to you so far in your life.
Hmm. Yeah, it's true. Who knows if that's a long or short story? I guess I just wanted to say also thanks for doing this. We are very peripherally mutual, so there isn't some prior chance we've had to like do that in like DMs or something. Like this was a kind of hit it off, and now really just hearing a lot of this for the first time, which is cool. So I was born in Texas. My family is still all in Texas, and I come from I guess I grew up in Austin, but my extended family lives in an area called Brady, Texas, which is small, a little more rural, and I really adore the family from that area. So I always think of myself as Texan, like, but something like Tejana, like very much indigenously from that environment. And it shapes my personality, I think, probably quite a bit. Like, I have a big family, particularly on my mom's side, and I think they're great. I feel like I was lucky to grow up in a family with many generations alive at the same time, and with a robust sense that there was a lot of love and that what I was interested in mattered because I was me. And so that put a lot of, I think, psychic protection around being who I am that maybe at the time I didn't even realize was going to be such a um, important feature of getting to keep going with who I am decades away. So I think a lot about that. I always really liked books and school and learning. I don't think anyone who met me when I was a kindergartner would be that surprised that I grew up to be a professor, but I'm really surprised by it. It's not what I intended. It's not where I aimed to go, but I definitely always loved just more. I just wanted to know more. So that was a big part of who I am, for better or worse. I think it makes me a bit between that and the Texanism, like a little bit aggressively interested in everything, a little bit like strong seeming in the way I express my ideas, even when even though I'm like, I think of myself as super open minded, in part because I'm so curious about the world. I left home at 16. I started college and moved to California. I did my degrees at Stanford, which matters because I moved to that area of the country right before the first like dot-com boom really hit its peak and that first crash. So like the formative experience of thinking about technology and how to be a person in the world, I think was really shaped by also watching that speculative bubble the first time around, and also thinking very positively about the promise of what you could do with more building in the world. So I really fell in love with trying to be helpful, I think, ironically, in that stage, right? Like picking up technical skills, thinking about design and humans. I think a lot of the interests from being a kid who was curious started to merge with a terroir that was shaping up in that moment. So this would have been turn of the millennium, right? Pre Y2K. Um, and I think that probably shaped me a lot. So some of the things that happened in that juncture that matter for this story is I had this deeply felt critique that I didn't have language for, but I think is really the kind of formative personal puzzle that has shaped the next set of decades in my life. And that was that everything we were being taught to think or build came from the perspective at some level that what you were doing was making a thing for a person. And this was a universal kind of person who, if you could solve the problem at the level of this atomic unit of the individual, you could scale up the solution and diffuse it to everybody and solve it at like the broadest possible area. And fundamentally, like, it just didn't seem to me like that's where most of human meaning and understanding come from, because maybe I had this experience as a young person. I had such a deeply felt sense that most of the ways we think about who we are and what we do and what the context is that constitute the problems and the opportunities before us begin in collectivity. And that idea of the like personal user experience just never seemed to me like an adequate description of what it was like to become a person in the world, because I didn't feel that way. And it seemed obvious to me, even through books and all the kinds of, like, you read Dostoevsky and it's like, oh my God, there's all these voices and all of these ways of being. I thought this just doesn't match. And I wanted to make things, but I couldn't figure out how to resolve these two problems of collectivity and how certain I was that it was the kind of constitutive fabric of what matters, and a set of solutions that were presuming something that actually wasn't grounded in collectivity, and then trying to build massive leverage scale off of these kinds of individual atomic units. So I want to pause here and just check in with you, because that's like a big chunk of content, and I don't know if I should keep going or pause. It's like a
Keep
half.
going. It's great.
Um, so I went to grad school. So I didn't quite know what to do. I had a long-term boyfriend who was amazing, and I definitely wanted to stick around where he was. And I thought, well, maybe if I become like something in the social sciences, that was as best I could figure out, that world must know something about the social parts, and that maybe I could use like very quantitative controlled methods to show that you could build technologies and architectures that generated feelings of collectivity or shared experience, and that how you arrange the world mattered, and that if that logic didn't already exist, maybe I could try to do things that designed and tested that kind of logic so that I could show that we could build things another way. And that was kind of the ambition. So I've always loved like architectural scale things, like anything you can do that's ritual, anything that just gives you that very strong feeling that the collective is in motion doing things, just has always been at some level like my ambition for what the technologies and materials of the world could help provide. And so I was doing like lab-based research with a guy called Cliff Nass, who was amazing. And I just kept writing these weirder and weirder papers, because the knowledge for things like, the dominant paradigm in the modern social sciences is also this fundamentally individual paradigm, especially in things like psychology. Like, we're not asking questions about collectivities. And so my papers kept sort of trying to pull from weirder and weirder reference points to then put this kind of like positivist, like statistically, significant language together. And things just kept getting like odd. And I felt like I couldn't resolve that crisis. So then I thought, well, maybe if I find other environments where people have natively cared about that collectivity, but they've made strong design choices about how they build their technologies and organizations in alignment with those values, I could see domains in the world where people also knew this and start to think about bringing those kinds of patterns into the lab. And so at that point, I found churches, which are like kind of obvious in retrospect, right? Like, if you can think about a domain that has been concerned with pushing the edge on technologies and techniques for human possibility for millennia, right? And then some in every tradition, it's like sacred spaces, right? People invest in them, they experiment with them. Like, to vault a ceiling is like serious math, I mean, these are really, really intense spaces of working out some of these dynamics. And at that point, I was like, oh, I need to reinvent myself as a historian or a scholar of culture, because this is the kind of thing I want to ultimately bring into a strong affirmative defense as key to a design principle said. Like we could go make worlds where we put collectivity at the core and like for all kinds of ends. It doesn't have to be religious ends or something like it, but I'm confident that we could build for collectivities, that we could tell histories about them, stories about where they come from and how they move, and that we can get in the pool and play at making better collectivities for ourselves or preserving collectivities of various sorts in a world that, where lots and lots of people think in many different ways. And so I think of the kind of next stage of my life as trying to reach back towards that building impulse and now start to like braid together this kind of long sensibility that like what I'm doing here is building culture, right? And figuring out how forms of collective life can better be generated, how they can do things that are more, at least from my vantage, inclusive and sustaining and ongoing. I want to like provision the kinds of conditions and systems and teach other people how to do that, that are built on this long sensibility that we needed to be doing this from the start and that we always kind of knew how, right? So it's a kind of reconfiguring what it is we think we're up to when we decide we're going to build. That's it. That's the big story.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's a really intellectual story, but I think it's the right one, Like I could tell personal stories, but I don't think that's what binds us,
Hmm.
I suspect.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Um, I want to start by asking, because my own father's family is from Texas, what that identity and culture meant to you and how you see that having affected you.
Um, Texas is a place that, proudly tells its children, right, about its Six Flags
Hmm.
and how it has been at least six nations, right? And then some and then some. And so, one thing I love about Texas is that it doesn't make sense as any kind of monologic fiction. It's so vexed and so conflicted with itself that the stories of its own vexed and conflicted nature are part of the charm also for Texans. So contradictions like are all over the place, horrible and lovely things happen next to each other. And so there's a little bit of interest in that tone, like that kind of mixture constantly in mind. It's a very unapologetic place, for better and worse, it holds itself in pretty high esteem. There's a little bit of let's take it out to the bike racks and settle it kind of energy
Hmm.
that I think has served me well, in that there's a willingness to settle a conflict directly and then let it go and like move on. And I think that's interesting. It's also a place that I think of not wanting to be from, in the sense that I love the people and I don't think I want to be there. It's a tough area.
Hmm.
There's not a moment that fights aren't possible. I don't mean necessarily physically, but it's an aggressive sort of culture in a way, or it really can be. Yeah.
How do you think that sort of lack of a monolithic identity compares to America as a whole?
Uh, I mean, I think we know we're living through a moment of great desire to hold on to a story of America, like whether it's to insist it's one way or it's going to be one way, or that, it would be, we have to go back to the beginning and decide which way it was. We're like in a really historicizing moment. And I think it's been very interesting to watch if you come from a place where, what do you mean one way? We've been at least six different ways. Even if you wanted to do the one, there's still the six. So then what are you going to do about that, right? Or to be someone whose family speaks like what I think of as like a pidgin Spanish, because that Spanish of West Texas has been there long enough to take on its own regional variations. It's like, well, this is the kind of space where people can talk about the border crossing us instead of crossing the border. It's also a place where you wouldn't really call what people are speaking properly Spanish or English. So that kind of deep regionalism makes me certain that you don't have to be one way, and that any stories about one wayness are probably just not looking at the ground closely enough, I guess. I
Hmm.
think that's a good thing to bring to this thinking about the US at this juncture.
Hmm. And you spoke about being dissatisfied with this narrative of like personal user experience where there's like an individual that if we solve a problem for them, it will work for everyone and could be scaled, and that really didn't resonate from your own personal experience. Can you give me some sense of why your intuitions pointed to a different direction and what experiences you had that made that sort of ring false?
All right, this is like a weird thing to say, but I don't know. There's two layers. One is a memory and the other is an internal experience. So I'll start backwards. I've always been really scared of meditating
Hmm.
because sitting still is really hard, So there's a lot going on in there. And I went to this 6 hour meditation retreat. So I was like, I'm just going to jump all the way in the pool, right? I can't handle this 45-minute thing. This is driving me crazy. So I went, and it was pretty hard for like the first few hours. And like all the stuff happens in your mind, and I was just getting over a cold even, so I was like really trying not to cough, that last day of like I'm gonna everything, just so much. And at some point I just got so frustrated with my inability to do it, probably like hour 3 or 4, let's say, that I can think about pushing back from the table and being like, you know what, I'm sick of all of you sort it out, not my problem. And the moment I could push back, I was like, who are all the you that like are in here that are going to solve it? And it was the first time I really had that crisp realization that the inner life of the mind is like, it's like being in a crowded, noisy room. And my inner life is pretty warm, I think, and sweet. So I was like, oh, it's like being in a great tavern or something with a big party at a table, and every once in a while everybody agrees and cracks up and laughs, right? And that's when I know, like, yes, that we were all in agreement. And so there was no contradictory voice that didn't have a seat at the table. They're all fine. And I started being really interested in that sense, that that's not an unusual mental experience. That's not a schizophrenia. It's just that's like literally what interiority is actually like for many people. And if you start to think about the fictions we read or the signs in art where you see other people at some level thinking about that kind of interiority, it's actually all over the place. We just ignore it and think about the single authorial voice. And so I know that can't be true. It's too ordinarily obvious that like collectivity is a interior and like exterior project, because bare minimum language binds us. So that's like, I don't know. I think that's the one piece.
Hmm.
The other one's from being like a very small child, waking up in my grandparents' house. And I was always the last person to get up. Everybody was awake. And I always felt really embarrassed to exit the room I was sleeping in, because the second I opened the door, my grandparents and would start this kind of litany of love. Ay, like preciosa, mira nomás, que linda, just on and on and on. And it was so overwhelming much attention first thing in the morning that I was like, oh God, I don't want to get out of bed. But now I think about having had that experience of opening your eyes into like a bunch of people adoring you. And I think, man, that's like pretty good stuff. And so it also lives in me as a kind of sensibility that I'm held by that early experience of relationality.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. I want to ask you about a couple of terms that I've heard you use, both in this conversation and elsewhere, that to me, I might be mishearing you, but seem sort of like technical terms that you have a specific meaning for them, that they're like they have a whole gestalt for you. And I want to know to start, what collectivity means to you.
I it's the best I can think of to describe something like language, for example, would be a good analogy. You're born into it, the terms that give your life world meaning are already being organized through it, like society and the social come first. And humans, in this case, like a poem and a language, don't lose any level of individual expression, but the primacy of that expressivity that we think of as individual is being built off of this kind of larger collectivity that's already sustaining and holding it. So, webs of relations, the limits of who belongs to the we and does not, cultural mechanisms. It's this terrain that I want to think about, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. Is that helpful
It
or
is, yes. And how about the word provisioning?
provisioning is like my favorite. I have two favorite words. It's one of them. But um, I think of provisioning as it's the like the practice of enabling ongoing practice at what you want to do. So you're guaranteeing that it's going to happen again later, ideally. And the reason to use it is like um, it's often a word that you use for like logistics, right? Military campaigns or things you keep in your cupboard. It's the stuff that sets the possibility that the thing you're up to can complete where it wants to go. And so I think a lot about how we sustain as an exercise in provisioning and about valuing people who make moves with that kind of provisioning in mind because they're thinking ahead multiple turns about emergent possible futures and they're planning for it, you know? So I think of that as just maybe increasingly an area of interest. And I really want to learn from other people who are into it too.
Hmm. Do you have a kind of almost like biographical story about how that word became important to you?
I woke up it like came to me in a dream, actually. Yeah. I
Hmm.
woke up one day and the words like Center for Creative Provisioning were in my head. And I was like, oh, right. I would join one of those, but they don't exist. So I guess let's go find out what they are.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Wow. I'm glad you're trusting that. Yeah. Um, what's your other favorite word?
Consubstantial.
Tell me about that word.
It's like a constitutive substance, both entities or all entities become the substance they are with the others. So as opposed to A causing B, you know, or something like it, or something having an essence up front, it's the consubstantial nature of something that is social.
Hmm. How did you encounter that word?
Trying to write about causality, I'm always trying to explain how these collectivities move and change and hang together across difference and as history unfolds. And so I'm always trying to invent a language that's almost like speaking in that register.
Hmm.
And I think I'm still quite early in a way in this process. Like in 2 decades, this will be obvious.
Are there any placeholders for words that you're yearning for but don't yet have?
So many. Oh my gosh. I'm okay. I've got this clunky one. Topologies of coordination. Ugh, you know, I'm trying to get at something like a space time that holds these provisioning moves up so that they can influence and mutually influence each other. And so sometimes it would feel like spooky action at a distance, but it's not because it's so mysterious. It's because something coordinated or aligned enough in a way that could circulate and make different entities receive at least a partial understanding. And it feels when that happens as if the something like the space-time of things folds together and creates new arrangements. But it's I think these are like normal social processes we don't quite have a good strong language for yet, you know.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have some kind of map or account of how these words that I've asked you about relate to each other? If at all, they may not be directly related, but I'm imagining you have connections between them.
I think so. I could imagine it's like having a it's like trying to build yourself a physics or something and get the concepts working together enough that you could pull the whole structure up and allow for explorations within its formal features, right? So I think of these words as starting to build together. Like once you've got collectivities, we're no longer playing in the world of the individual atomic unit. So that changes the physics of everything. If you begin like n equals 3 as your base case, is real different than n equals 1 or even 2, you know? So I think, wow, okay, now you have to think about multiplicities and multiplexities and how do you hang things together enough that they can stay recognizable, and when do you know they've moved? And so you start to kind of bootstrap this need to describe these processes and invent a language for doing that work. And then you have to decide, like, do I sacrifice that new language I've built to think with to align with a language that has come before, or do I resist the gravity and pull others towards my poetry because I think it will free them from some of the things that the language they're working in has trapped them in thinking about? And that's a tough challenge.
Are there any thinkers that you admire that you feel like have done this shape of a deed or work well, where they gave birth to a new kind of language or physics that described a territory that they were interested in?
Yeah, I think it happens all the time. The
Hmm.
strong ones do it, right?
Yeah,
Like
but which
they
ones do you admire?
I mean, I would say like Bakhtin is kind of high on my
Mm,
list of
mm.
people I admire. As a kid growing up, like I loved this book, Gödel Escher Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. I'm like, oh, right, that's so interesting and powerful. I think sometimes musicians do it, you know, like they show you a different key something could be in that you didn't see before. You know, there's moments of it like that. And I kind of think it's everywhere, you know? Is right? Isn't that what art's trying to do? It's giving you a like Gabriel Garcia Marquez takes it from, you know, Juan Rulfo, but it's the move of letting you enter a new space time and explore it and see what conditions it allows for a subject to be in the world, right? Yeah.
Okay, tell me about your tattoo and how you chose to have that emblazoned upon your arm.
Um, I also, after I had my second child, I I think it was right before I had just gotten tenure and it was right before the Trump election. So, in that height of thinking about finishing multiple works I had been, I think of as great labors, right? Like a certain moment in academic life, a sense of your family having arrived. It was a very difficult pregnancy. And so there was a lot of relief from many anxieties. And then this feeling of I guess the post Obama hope years, right? And the Trump years, just a weird moment. And there's a lot of hormones and, you know, it's a lot to take on becoming like a parent every time. And so I was thinking so much those days about like, I'm not religious, but I was thinking so much those days about like Jesus and the Bible. And also like, it's so weird. Like if I thought that and my deity left me like personal communication, like letters of some kind, I would be reading it like all the time because that would seem to be like the most important thing one could be doing with their time. And if I thought I could speak to like the divine, whatever, it's like, what else would I be doing? That's amazing, right? And so I was just thinking so much about this process during that time period. And maybe the synthesis of all of those things kept bringing the like almost like an earworm. Like I could hear this kind of end part of like Paul's like letter to the Corinthians. It's like you hear it sometimes at weddings, like love is patient, love is kind, blah 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 blah, you know. But I just kept hearing the last half of the last line in my ear, like "but the greatest of these is love," but the greatest of these is love, like on repeat. And I'm like, oh my god, that's really annoying. You know, what's the deal? So the whole letter is really about like growing up, becoming like a man, and like putting away the things of one moment and staying with the things that matter for the long term in the process of this conversion. And so the line is ending with saying that of the things that abide in him, the greatest are faith, hope, and love, right? But the greatest of these is love. And I was like, yeah, totally, right? You could almost put anything on the other side of that line. And I think that the greatest of these would be love. And I was like, oh no, it's my tattoo because it's obvious that it won't stop running through my head until it lives in a space that occupies the intersection between the world and myself. So I tried to place it there. And I'm comfortable letting the words blend into my skin so long that maybe someday they're not legible, but it's like in my bones, right? So I spend a lot of time around people who I think don't think what I think, right? I'm really comfortable often around people with very different mindsets, but I would want people to know that the interface between us, they can at least trust that I'm trying to be an institution builder from that vantage that I agree that the place to build from is love. There's not something instrumental at stake in the way I deal with the world or people. And I'm willing to try to practice embodying that mystery. I don't have an answer for it, but that's what makes it my tattoo. It's like that's that's mine to take up and work with.
Hmm. How has having that tattoo on your body affected your life and the way that you act and the way that you see things in the time that you've had it?
I think it helped me turn towards thinking more about institutions, right? Like Paul isn't even a figure I completely like. If I were picking like, characters you love, he's a vexed one. Like this is not the Jesus figure that's and I have no ambitions to be any of these people as such, but this is someone who's kind of like an administrator, like who's trying to like, get everyone on the same page with memos, it's like not great. And so I think, like part of what I want to reconcile is thinking about the values that you want to align with and love here. And the fact that you have to do stuff with them, like provision those conditions sometimes with institutions or organizations, like, oh no, like I have to wrestle with that very much in the world quality. And that brings up a lot of like ethical conundrums. I think it has been something that has allowed me to keep having crises of conscience, for better or worse, but it has started a process in my character that's clearly going to continue to unfurl over the next many decades. And I don't know where that leads, but I guess I care about institution building, apparently.
How would you describe what love is?
I guess I would say love is. It just seems so evidently the case and the business at hand that that is what is. I think some of its features might be, at least as I can feel them, that this collectivity thing I'm interested in seems to fit just fine with the idea of a cosmos where love is possible. And I'm sure that the cosmos is one where love is possible. If everywhere I am acting from love, then I've kind of answered my own question about the nature of the universe, I guess, I think.
How would you describe or put into words what that question was?
I think most people are really asking, like, is this a loving universe, right?
Hmm.
Am I loved here? I think that's really a structuring question for almost everyone's life. And that once you're living on the other side of that question, it's a different ballgame, honestly. And so I'm interested in people living on the other side of that question, right? Not that life gets easier, but it's a different ballgame. And I'm interested in trying to do what I can to condition it being an available answer for others.
Hmm. You said earlier, I'm not religious, but, and
Right.
I'm putting that in contrast with some of the things you've just said, and I wonder what you mean by that.
I think I'm like the least I'm like the most super religious spiritual person of all the not religious not. I don't know. My thinking was that anything religion can do, the secular world better be able to do if it's really going to stand up a science. Like, should be no topic that's like uh, forbidden, right? And I think in the rush to make the modern academy, we kind of threw out like in at least in the Western tradition, like anything that smacked of coming from a theological world. And so we made some real errors in thinking about modernity that we need to go back and fix. And we need to be able to talk with people who've been working on other metaphysics so that we are comfortable thinking about other kinds of causality and materiality that keep coming back and rearing their heads as real substantive questions that are hard to ignore.
How would you describe some of those errors that you think we made?
Well, we got really into these individuals, right? Like, as opposed to thinking about something where dependencies and participating in the world were really were real, right? Or we came to make fun of forms of reasoning that didn't cause a Newtonian outcome. And
Hmm.
yet, standing on the other side of relativity, it's like, well, it's probably useful to think about how that Newtonian paradigm locked too heavily into the way we think about social and economic systems. And then we bracketed out any kinds of phenomena that couldn't be studied with the tools at hand. And that's just not a really robust way to do science. And I think if you scratch not that far, lots of people know, but we have to kind of know together to make paradigm changes happen.
Let me sit with how to phrase this question. Um, well, it's a two-part question. Let me ask you a two-part question. If I understand you correctly, there's a pendulum and we swung historically too far towards individualism, and you want to see us swing back more towards collectivity. Is that a fair representation of what you've said?
Let's say it's not even a pendulum.
Okay.
Like it's so unusual a project that most of what we think of in the kind of cultural and historical record is rife with stories that are not about the base unit being the individual, right? The anthropological record ain't telling us that. And so we made a misstep and we hit a cul-de-sac in our thinking. And there's some real power in maintaining that. But we know that the world is built in a more ecological fashion than that. And it would be a good time to drop the pretense that it begins with these individuals and seek a more robust science to describe basic things, um, both because we have tools that can allow for that, like really powerful computers. We should put them to use. It's okay. And because we just know that most of our crises involve ecological forms of address. So it would be useful to have a basic science that looks like that too.
Hmm. How?
And tell me if I should change registers of speech because I can do that if this feels.
You're good. You do you. You're doing great. Uh, I'm imagining that in your work as a professor, you maybe even often encounter people that you're working with who don't see the world the way that you do, that are maybe in this individualistic paradigm. How would you point them towards or even nudge them towards seeing that collectivity is maybe a more natural default or a more historical norm when that individualism is the exception?
Sometimes you have to, it depends. Like, there are people who are comforted once you remind them that they already know this.
Hmm.
You switch into the mode of speaking from that position, and at first they sort of go, "Well, that sounds weird." And you just give them a second and remind them that they too have these descriptive empirical experiences. And once they remember, then it helps start the process of changing how we talk to each other. Then there are people who are really committed to the tools they've learned to make something true. That can be really hard. And it's understandable. Like there's a lot to lose by letting one set of assumptions go. And in that sense, my hope is that you really try to figure out how to define cases that shouldn't be possible if their theory holds. So I'm often looking for the kind of right, it's like a proof by contradiction. You're like, okay, 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 I accept your premise, I accept your premise, and therefore here's something that contradicts the possible outcomes if those premises hold, just to start the process of sending the person back thinking about why they have to take their own assumptions seriously, you know, rather than accept the assumptions that they've been given and then practice the tools from those assumptions, even when it's no longer serving them. Right. So I try to aim my arrows very precisely in that sense.
Hmm. What function do you imagine the appearance of individualism served our species? What do you think it did for us?
I think that there is a great how would I say it? You can get into connection is not necessarily good. Like collectivity does not mean better, and individualism does not mean like worse. It's not that kind of thing. What do you do if you're in a situation that's like a bad equilibrium? You know, one way to solve it is to try to exit the situation or to divest from the dependencies within it. And so there's moments of like real strength in the move that is to say, like, this collectivity is no longer whole. And what challenges its wholeness is the ability for the actors inside of that set to change their position radically. Right. So you can think about the kind of liberal position of the individual as allowing for markets to emerge, for people to break with feudal like constructions, maybe for like women to make claims for suffrage, and rights, and a claim to universalism as a basis for those rights, that is each and every one of these, no matter how particular, is just like all the others. And so it's not a desire to divest from these expressions, but I think it's not a great description for what happens or will happen. Like the truth is, you never get to be completely outside of the social. Like that moment never arrives. And to even have the appearance of it takes so much support off scene that is not acknowledged, from the people who make the roads and the people, the state bureaucracy, blah blah blah. Like there's so much going on that I can understand as a political like fiction, but it's just not a very helpful description of the social world, you know.
Hmm.
So I don't want us to confuse those two things, because that takes some of the power off the table for us to be able to design or think about alternatives.
Hmm. Just sitting with how to ask this question again. I could imagine someone being concerned that we might lose something by reincorporating collectivity as a way of seeing. And I wonder how you might suggest making that move in a way that preserves what has been useful or functional about individualism.
Yeah, right. Because we've been told, I think, right, that it's individuals versus collectives,
Hmm.
and that maybe it's a binary, or at least it's like a line, like a spectrum, and that there's something that you lose if you go one direction and something you gain, right? And so I think maybe the final piece in the whole Roman arch of this project was maybe in the last year, I really hit a place where I couldn't avoid that what pinned that thought in place was a kind of zero sum thinking. And this is something that I really credit a scholar named Scott Ferguson with helping jigger in my brain, was the kind of bravery to go ahead and let the thought get as deep as it needed to get to change how I saw the world. Um, and so that zero sum piece as an assumption is sort of supporting the idea that it's one versus the other, as opposed to thinking about contexts where they are mutually constitutive in some way, where individualism even is guaranteed and preserved by collectivities. It's an inescapable feature, like the water holding up the boats in an ocean. Like there can be millions of boats, but the ocean is doing the work of backing even those kinds of precious sensibilities. And so, to the person who wants to feel maximally free as an individual affirmatively, you actually need like laws and states and other people doing all kinds of things to give you that sensibility. And so again, I would say like that is a political fiction. That's okay. Like we have lots of them and maybe we want them. But if we want to notice what it takes to get that done, then we have to kind of think around what is not a trade-off between these things, but more of like a totally different physics from which to speak about those things. And we're going to have to go back and re-examine all of our assumptions, maybe keep some language, maybe change the language, but they're not threats to each other as such. There's probably 1,000 different variations of expressions and forms, but it's not a tension against one. You don't lose something by being able to see the other.
I think I'm hearing two different things that you didn't necessarily say explicitly, but I'm sort of reading between the lines. So I want to mirror them and see if check if they're right. The first is individuality and collectivity are consubstantial. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then the second one is something like um, there are uh, was it topologies of coordination? Is that what you said? Okay, there are topologies of coordination between individuality and collectivity that are zero sum.
Let me try that piece another way. So the
Hmm.
second part, there are zero sum, there's a zero sum understanding underneath the kinds of knowledge we tell about the world often. And that zero sum assumption makes us treat categories as if to maximize one is to minimize the other, right?
Mm.
And so they're in some kind of trade-off. And that if the threat is that if we veer from exploring one side of the equation, we're something is at threat. And so individuals and collectives are like a perfect example of this thing. We tell
Mm.
this story. Sometimes we even go so far as to make it an east-west story or something. It's kind of grotesque when you think about it, that some things are collective and the other things are individual. And maybe even the modern and forward is individual, but the past and the tradition is collective. And it's like as if we're jettisoning ourselves towards more and more atomic, like individuation. And we're going to be on these liberal markets, blah, 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 blah. And then we also like lament the fact that we used to have this thing and now it's all fallen apart and we don't have it anymore, right? We fell out of the Garden of Eden or whatever, right? And that tendency is not rational, right?
Mm.
It's down a layer. It's like a metaphysical sensibility for things. We don't talk about it that way, but that is what we're doing over and over again. And so what I want to do is try to help change that groundwork so that when we think about individuals, we're not thinking about something that is in tension with collectivity. The collectivity part is so robust that it's the thing guaranteeing all kinds of different forms, including the form of the individual as an expression. The same way that language grants poetry, even the nonsense poetry. You don't lose anything by great poems aren't poems first and then language is invented, right? And so the topology of coordination is about how these different collectivities change, and we can talk about what role individuals play in that process, but collectivity is where the action is. Does that make sense?
Would you agree with the following statement? Collectivities make individuality possible.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
great. I want to come back to what you said about East versus West because that's certainly a narrative that I've been exposed to and even found useful, and I wonder how you see it.
I mean, which West, right? which right? I think it starts to fall apart pretty quickly on close inspection of how people actually live and give meaning to their lives. But that's different than how they describe why their life is meaningful or what they think is going on. And so we could think about moments of, for example, I think about like inheritance law in the United States, where you have extraordinary socialism being practiced in collectivity and the passing down of like a trust, let's say, to people, but it's bounded within the construction of a kinship group or a family group as a, that's a radically collective moment, but we don't speak about that as a collectivity. We'll call West individuals, and that doesn't describe the practice there at all, right? Just as if you take some other place, you'll see somebody do something radically self-serving or radically liberated or who knows what, whatever. And in that moment, that is a kind of thing we might call individual, even though we locate it in a place that we've already decided must be where the collectives are. And so I try to just like remind people like, look, stop and notice, right? And things get a lot weirder on the ground than a binary will let you think.
I want to circle back to something that I think you spoke a little bit about, but I'd like to know more about your training as a experimental psychologist and what that was and what that means and what that was like and what you learned.
I worked with this guy named Cliff Nass, who I think is like just amazing, such a genius. He was really interested in um, the cues that technology gives you that make you behave as if it were a person, like social cues. So he was doing these really great experiments with things like, like you would use like an oscilloscope, and it might say something to you like, "That was such a good measurement you took," you know. And then later, when people are asked like about how many significant figures the oscilloscope could record or register, the one that gave you the polite compliment would be regarded as if better, technically better than the others, right? And this is like a super robust effect of all kinds of things. Like um, we our brains don't make some distinction between like psyches, artificial or real, not because we're dumb or something, right? We don't get confused, but because those social cues are so powerful that shapes things. So now in the present, maybe like AI is rehearsing a lot. They will, over the next X years, AI thinkers will rediscover many of Cliff Nass's principles that have been there all along as a paradigm for computing and social action, well before computers could do this stuff, right? So I was working with this guy, and I think that impulse to play across the boundaries and to keep an eye on the enduring question being how we socially belong to each other, I think set the pace for me, in even in sort of thinking about what's at stake in psychology or history, et cetera. His methods were very quantitative, very controlled. We would design experiments, and have subjects come into the lab, and you have different conditions, and then you try to make sure that there's more variance between the condition groups than within any group, all that stuff. So that kind of, work is the daily practice of doing psychology. Does that help kind of
Hmm.
paint a scene a bit more?
How do you think that that practice informed your thinking or the way you approach your work?
I think I'm still always looking for those great cases, right? Those great arrows where you can go, I've sliced up, I've taken this massive thought, but I've sliced it very precisely. And if this is wrong, then this should happen, right? And you're still kind of doing that tight work in designing what it is you look at.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How I would like you to tell me about your work and how you think about the different parts of it or how they relate to each other.
I'm a cultural historian, and I'm writing like a trio of books that is about the rise of a kind of evangelical worldview. I don't know. I've gone back and forth with many titles that describe the whole thing. Um, I thought about topologies of coordination. there are days I think about calling it American collectivity, you know, because it's in a discourse that seems to be very ascendant right now, and that does make a lot of defensive. Where are the individuals and where are the collectives? I think about it as a set of books that's really about conservative innovations. So, thinking about changes in different domains that are absolutely about collective life and watching how they build each other up to generate a worldview. I've got a book about the rise of megachurches, which totally require all this technology and are really aggressive adopters of that stuff in the late 20th century when secularity was supposed to be underway. So something going on there that transformed what Protestantism looked like. And then a book that's going to be about households and family formations, and it's going to be about multi-level marketing as the case. Another one of these like bizarre things, but it's like it's all kinship lines as a structure for doing capital accumulation. Like what, you know? So we need to sort of reckon with what that means as a collectivity structure. And then the third is going to be about the rise of classical Christian schools, which are right now kind of also making headway into the Trump regime in different ways. And so imagining readers who are doing Western canon kind of stuff and how that comes roaring back, what that's about. So how you make little people and future generations. And so that provisions, right, a kind of total worldview and this kind of topology of coordination aligns these spheres enough that you can kind of see like a long arc of how this cosmology has been building its way forward. So that's kind of like that's my empirical like normie history work that I do on a daily basis. Flesh out that thesis. That's the big one.
What would you say are the questions that are animating your curiosity with your work?
I think it's this question about like how collectivity works, right? And so it's how do you I've picked a case where you've got like a very traditional cultural narrative. So something's supposed to be way back there and not way in the future, right? Pro- Provisioning, but how does that kind of traditional cultural narrative then actually like shape a migration into a new technological regime? Right. So I'm using it as the driver of transformation because I think we can use collectivity and culture to drive technological transformation rather than the other way around.
If you're trying to do something like create a language or a physics of collectivity, what are some of the rudimentary grammar elements or particles or some of the most fundamental aspects of what you've discovered so far?
Um, I would say if you're gonna if you're gonna change a culture, you have to do it by changing how interactions happen regularly across domains that think they're unrelated. You need people who are not like each other as far apart as possible on some social graph to be regularly like going back and forth. And so it's not a one turn move. You're trying to tilt the axes. That's a really big one. So I'm convinced at this point that cross domain, not even multidisciplinary, but get as far between domains as you can if you want to really get the leverage to shift the way a culture moves. So I'm pretty committed to that. Um, I think you have to have something that circulates and is ambiguous enough that people keep needing to circulate it. This is what publics and publicities are for. So any kind of media or content you're making, any kind of language you're making, any kind of organizational structure, it's got to be something that's not already understood because then the pool of people who belong to your universe of talk is quite small. It's the stuff we partially understand that seems up for grabs a little bit that moves the most because it moves across domains as people go, does this belong to me or you? Is this mine and yours? Do we both recognize this is real? And it's generating that kind of circulatory ambiguity that asks people to come to the table to keep having to decide the question over and over again. So I would say like you can't be afraid of that. In fact, that's really important. That's part of how culture moves. And that then culture tries to contain the movement by convening people together. And so the seats at the table really matter a lot. If you want to have a different interpretation, you got to have different kinds of people at the table when you have a convening. Because if you have the same kind of person all of the time, you actually can't change what categories work like. It's got to be like always this, right? I think another one that I would really think of as like a huge insight in my mind was that this kind of model means that domains that look radically far apart to some people have very similar qualities and that you can make moves that speak to several domains. And I would call this something like multiplexing. You can make one move like Chuck Norris, right? Like I can kill like three stones with one bird or something, kind of. But you want to look for those moves because they're leverage points for seeming to do things at a distance when actually like it's the resemblance in the coordination mechanism or the practice that makes these things that are seemingly far apart actually radically close together from some vantage. And those are, I think, the sweet spots to think with.
Hmm.
And then finally, just the last one is this is a long-term thing. So if you, it's unlikely you're going to get the results you want in 6 months, but I don't know that it's unlikely you can provision conditions to make cultural transformation over the course of 3 decades. And so you might as well try.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm curious what your experience of being in academia has been like.
I don't think I love it. I think that's probably a common experience. Um, and it's and classrooms are about the most magical things there are. Um, just some of the best, most abiding, wonderful moments really do like happen with other people when the lights turn on for all of you. So
Hmm.
that's cool. I love a lot of the colleagues. It's great to get up every day and think what you want to think. Um, it's a strange space. We've been living through academia transforming a lot. So a lot of the features of the university that people love most are minor in the scheme of what a university is as an organization, which also means there's probably other places where some of that really great stuff is happening, but we don't call it the academy. And so it's probably a good time to think about how we could cross domain learn and research and make service and teaching together to the benefit of many people in several domains at the same time.
Hmm. What do you think contributes to the sort of status quo or norm that common occurrence that people don't love academia?
Um, I think partially that it's generally such a competitive place and it's unclear why. So if you've gotten this far in it, then most of the people who you know didn't, you know, by definition. And that can feel very, you have to come up with a story to make sense of that. Maybe your story is that you're so much better, right? Maybe your story is that you're so very lucky. Maybe your story is that you're an imposter and any moment now they're going to find out. Maybe it's that you're still someday going to be approved of and you're not sure you've really made it. But it creates a lot of pathological stories of scarcity for people who come to this work generally out of a space of love because there's easier paths to have taken, right? In this way, it's probably not unlike a lot of professional athletic endeavors or whatever. And that scarcity is really intense. It's hard to escape it. And then on the other side, actually educating and making and helping people grow is like an extremely resource intensive process. Like it doesn't scale well. There's not a lot of shortcuts. And so the investments are huge. And you could imagine a society where we're maximizing educational possibilities for people. And I think that would be a very different ballgame, but we're kind of trapped in, I think, as subjects managing these questions of austerity. And it's not good for intellectual life. Not really.
How do you think the dynamics of collaboration and competition fit into collectivity?
Um, we might think about them both as mechanisms of coordination, right? They are moments of ambiguity that ask, like, who is the we here, you know? And maybe the we involves me being the best at something, and maybe the we involves that we all showed up at the same thing, but they're all still calling the question of the boundaries of which domain we belong to and what we're doing in that domain, what the organization is of our actions and interactions. And so to me, they don't look that different. So one of the tragedies, I think, for competition to get bound up in scarcity is um, often it's kind of an invented scarcity, and competitions can happen all of the time without the necessity for something to be ended or taken off the table forever, right? Very few competitions require the total obliteration of the other side of the table, you
Hmm.
know? And so I want to uncouple and unforge those so that it's okay. Like things, we can play all kinds of different ways and different social games together, but maybe we don't need that one.
Hmm. So part of your work is also being a media scholar, and I wonder from that perspective and also from a personal perspective of just being you, how you see the place that we met, namely Twitter.
When did we meet? Was it after the pandemic
It
or
must have
before?
been, yeah.
Even after the pandemic? Twitter is like, um, I live in New York. So Twitter is not unlike being on Broadway, let's say, in December, looking at the windows that are on Fifth Avenue, let's say, with the windows, the Christmas decorations, right? And it's like you're kind of there looking at the windows, but actually you're kind of there listening to everything everybody else is saying about the windows, and you're all sort of kind of there for each other, right? And so it's like, well, what's the value being created here? I think of Twitter as like a pretty good analog of that process. Like we are the kind of chorus commenting sometimes on whatever, but we're really there for the side talk of each other and the pleasure of like bumping into overhearing, partially understanding, riffing, like making comments on what one another says. Like that kind of democratic multi-vocalism is the joy of something like Twitter and probably why I hang out there. I love the way that the comments and like there's no hierarchy, right? Of the content maker and then the respondents. Any given turn at any given moment can spawn different kinds of dialogues and riffs and plays and alternatives. And I love that jazz. That feels like that sort of healthy collectivity holding up everything. So as a media scholar, I'm always trying to put that mediation first. We don't lose something by saying you can play in many directions all the time.
Hmm. I like to think of my Twitter as a series of games played in parallel, and I wonder how you think of your presence there and from this frame of games, like what games you're playing.
I think I'm trying to make sure that because I talk to people who have very different belief systems often, I want them to feel always like they can get enough of a read of who I am outside of a strictly professional face that they know what they're dealing with, right? And they can do a little bit of like validation of who that person is. So just trying to let it be multi-voiced. There's nothing to hide or nothing to prove in case somebody might want that to decide that they're comfortable having a deeper conversation with me, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's like the tattoo, right?
Hmm.
So it gives people a little bit of an interface to coordinate, and then you accept that their cosmos may be totally different than your own, but they at least know that this is kind of what your priors and your givens are, and
Hmm.
they can feel it out. They don't have to go deep with it, but we see what we can make
Hmm.
as meaning.
Hmm.
Yes. I mean,
I
that's kind
want
of what we're doing, right? Okay.
say more about that.
Well, just like very, very thin signal. Oh, look, we both agree that this thing is super important enough to
Hmm.
tattoo it.
Hmm.
Opens a little, and we don't know that much about each other, right? And so the
Hmm.
first bits of it are going to be they're going to take some tolerance and patience between us. Like, I don't know your language, you don't know my language. Okay, that's cool. That's not scary.
Hmm.
Partial understanding is enough. It hangs together. And then we sort of like slowly do this kind of partial coordination work, right?
Mm, mm. Yes, that's true. I want to ask about your personal life and being a mother and mm, what kind of mother do you aspire to be? How do you approach being a mother?
I used to try to hide from the kids that I work a lot, you
Mm,
know? Like I guess I had some thought like mothers feel totally available, right? Like a perfect universe of
mm,
something. And the pandemic really like made that impossible in a way. Like context all came home. And so it was very obvious. And I think about the mother I am after that. Sorry, in that I kind of trust that I'm like the mother they need, not the mother in some way that I was imagining, but just as I start to find out who they are, it's actually, they don't need everything from me, but there's a couple things that each of them needs very specifically. And if we can have that, then we're both quite wild and free to be the people we are. Um, and so it's a much lighter touch. Like we're super connected. I really enjoy parenting. It's like very cool and awesome. Um, but you try to find that touch point of balance between the two of you so that you always know that as you move and grow, you can keep moving and growing together, right? That the surface will hold. Yeah.
what have you tried to weave into the collectivity that is your family?
Well, I think I took zero sum off the table,
Mm,
right? Like we're like a pretty like it just ain't that's not a solution. There's no place where a creative possibility couldn't be thought.
mm,
There's no done point, right? And I think to let children live knowing that there is no done point, that you are you're loved, you belong. That's not, I'm not asked, there's nothing you have to do or that you could fail to do. That's not the conversation we're having here. Creates the sense that there are more interesting conversations to be having. Like now that you know you're in, right? Now, what do you want to do? Right? Like, what do we want to go build and explore? And so that's that bit of like, I'm trying to help people. I'm trying to have conversations with people who get to spend their life living on the other side of that question.
mm,
But because I would wish that for people and I think it's true, but also like I'm genuinely curious what they'll come up with that I'll learn from.
mm.
Yeah.
If this conversation today in late November of 2024 were the exact midpoint of your life and you lived exactly the same length of time that you had lived up till now for the rest of your life, what would you hope or aspire for the remainder of your life?
I really want to build things. I want the back half of my life to be like wildly involved in enormous amounts of like collaboration and construction. Like I want to I want to help move the needle on uh, letting that zero sum thinking that undergirds so much of what limits us go. I really want us to have a different kind of social physics that's an ordinary place we build from that says, you know what, inclusive, like uh, sustaining futures are possible. We can do it. So I would want to think about from here on out the legacy being about helping and shaping and participating in that kind of building. Like the Center for Creative Provisioning is coming.
Uh-huh. Tell me
Yeah.
about that.
Well, just I that sense of like, oh, I don't know what that manifests as, but the the role, the kind of synthesis of figuring out the greatest of these things is love, and the interest in institutions is like, oh, well, it's time to go provision that possibility and get involved in helping change culture.
Mm. What would you hope for the culture that's ubiquitous on the day that you die?
I would hope that this, like the zero sum thing, seemed as absurd as thinking that the sun revolves around the earth,
Hmm.
that we would know that that was something people used to think, but that we don't let that control our imaginations or our organizational life or our economies anymore. Very few things work that way. And so we just move on and we think of good leaders as people who have possibilities for creatively provisioning ongoing practice with each other. But that's done. And we don't come back because that would seem bizarre.
Well, we've covered a huge swath of territory on many dimensions. I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to dive more deeply into or share more about or talk about.
I mean, I'm honestly curious what I can't tell where things seem shallow or deep, right? Because this is very much from inside of my head. So I'm really curious about what resonates with you or where you go, yes, I hear that tune too, or no, I don't. Like what it feels like from your side.
Hmm. Um, I guess my experience at this point in the conversation is like, I've been so intrigued to have met you and the conversations that we've had so far, and it's felt like a hint of possibility and clarity that you have a whole worldview and way of seeing things and a language and a vocabulary for understanding the world and relating to the world. And that's a language and a worldview that I've wanted to learn more about. And so I feel like I've uh, certainly not exhausted that, but like really been introduced through this conversation to, especially some of the fundamental words of your vocabulary and what they mean to you, and really heard them not only as, because I've asked you those same questions before, but it's one thing to see the words or to read them or have a sense of it, but it's another thing to feel like you received it and it's clicked and uh, this is something. And so I think I feel able to relate a lot of the things that I've cared about and put effort into asking about or working on in that vocabulary now. I'm like, I see how, like, for example, I think one of the tweets I was planning to send you afterwards, but I'll just mention now since you're asking, is one of a tweet that I'm very fond of, which is the Hegelian synthesis of individualism and collectivism. And uh, you know, uh, it's less about Hegel, but more that, well, in understanding my own life, I think I grew up in a very individualistic context, and that was fine and good. But that when I went to monasteries and also I worked on in some farming cooperatives when I was like 21, those two experiences, but especially being in monasteries, really showed me a whole new way of being that was more collectivistic, and um, I saw how that was a medicine to diseases I didn't even know I had, basically. That's a very stark way of putting it, but it showed me blind spots that I had, and it showed me ways of relating to other people and groups that I didn't know were possible. And that was very healing for me. It made me happier. It made me feel more fulfilled, made my life more meaningful. Um, and then I hit a limit of that. And I at least like this pendulum metaphor because I hit a limit where it was like, oh, this is too much collectivity. This is too much collectivism. And actually, I really need to come back to myself as an individual and my own needs and boundaries and preferences and goals and honor that. And I think I had, from a certain perspective, I had sort of a developmental puberty or shift over the last, 3, 4 years of my life where uh, I went through a stage of finding myself and coming back to myself after having been absorbed into a collectivity. And um, so anyway, I relate to a lot of the things that you're saying from those perspectives. And I mean, I love having received the words provisioning and topologies of coordination as well, because I would have used different words to describe those, but those are things that I very much care about. And it seems really important to have language to talk about these and collectivity and show people these worlds that are possible and these ways of relating that are possible and make those more available to people. And that's certainly something I care a lot about with my work in a lot of different dimensions. So yeah, my experience of this conversation is like I have been introduced more deeply into your world and that we can have that conversation on deeper terms now that I understand a bit more about how you see things and how it all fits together. And for me, just one last thing is that for me, understanding concepts like that or understanding a language or a worldview or a philosophy really for me is embedded in a person and their life and who they are and their mannerisms and the way they speak and the way they show up in the world and they're not actually separate for me and um, so to have a chance to have an extended conversation with you in the context of you sharing your life story and being able to ask about things that might seem unrelated, like, what kind of mother do you want to be? Or, that kind of thing about your life or your tattoo. It's like, for me, those are very much woven together and make it possible to have some of those like conceptual upgrades or shifts or downloads where it's like, oh, okay, now I can receive this concept because I know who it's coming from and I know where it's coming from and the context in which that came from.
Yeah. I guess just to echo something back your way about the pendulum, I would I would want to propose that the sensibility of, since we know the sense of being an individual is kind of a gestalt or a genre in a way, that the parts that can be reconfigured create some play so that the pendulum doesn't have to be a pendulum. It's a little bit more like that. It's what resists that. I think what you're talking about is just so important, that feeling of that there's a absorption that's possible in the kinds of collectivities that we often talk about that feels like threatening and maybe even like a little fascist or culty or like name your bad thing, right? And I don't want to disavow that those are real feelings. And so if we could, I think maybe a shared project is find ways to show people that once you see the partsness, you can reconfigure and design, and it's not, you don't have to be one thing or the other thing. Now there's some recombinant like grammars and styles and like multiplicities. And there's a ton of stuff we just don't know in that area. We need like people to go try it out and leave notes for each other. And I don't know if that resonates with something, but it feels like there's some body of work that's missing there that would be really great to get more examples or cases from.
I completely agree. And I think that's both what you said just now and this whole conversation are kind of stitching together different lines of inquiry or exploration that I want to follow up with you about over the coming months and years. Where I'm like, oh, I think I'm very curious what Erica thinks about that and what she'd say about that. And um, but yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
Mm.
Is there anything else that feels alive for you or that you'd like to say more about?
I think maybe just a kind of meta observation about having this conversation like now, right? It's almost a new year. And it might be the halfway point, you're right, like of life. And so notes from the middle, and in transformations, I feel very aware of the clumsiness of trying to talk in a funny way. And I think about like all the strategies, like everything from the brilliance of The Simpsons, where like nobody gets all the jokes and we're all comfortable with it because we get enough of them and it's pleasurable. Like, is the goal to speak 12 ways at once, but make it so pleasurable that you can carry your audience? Is it to find a way to make it in the most plain speech that you think already exists? Is it to just punch the gas and get weirder and weirder? Like, what kind of language do you decide to live in once you know you can change your language for the back half of life? And I think for me, that question feels very awkward and undetermined. It's kind of like a puberty of a sort, right?
Hmm.
Into one's own voice. And so I'm very hyper aware of that right now, and that there's like a record of that, and that I wouldn't have that freedom to be so awkward with maybe other people, but I do feel that
Hmm.
with you
Hmm.
because we know and don't know each other in a way.
Hmm.
It's like an interesting set point that, like, I don't know what comes on the other side. And that's really neat. I'm really glad to have that occasion to capture the awkwardness of it, you
Hmm,
know. Um, and
hmm,
I'm really grateful that you hold that space so well. It's a
hmm,
deep skillfulness.
thank you. Um, three things are coming up hearing about that. The first is that it's just really important to me in these conversations to put on and step into an attitude of really trying to understand someone else's world and what it's like to be them and how they see things, and engaging with that charitably, where I just honestly want to understand how someone sees things, and uh, almost stepping back from discernment or disagreement or weighing it, but just trying to hear their world on their own terms and how they would describe it. And I think that's so important for my own learning process. And also, yeah, I feel it's an act of kindness to just listen to someone, both their words and what they're saying in conversation, but also to listen to who they are and how they are orienting towards the world, to listen to that even more than what they're saying. Of course, what they're saying also, but um, and so that's what I hear you appreciating, and I wanted to put words to that. Uh, the second thing is I don't resonate with the word awkward in this case because um, although I love that word, I've always resonated with that word to describe myself because I feel awkward often. But how to put it? It seems to me that something that is being given birth to like this, that's arising in the world, that's emerging in the world, is, yeah, you could describe it as awkward, but I'd see it more as like a distribution problem in that it's just not well distributed. And as it becomes more well distributed, it becomes more of an affordance that's taken for granted and it's normalized. And I'm thinking about Christianity actually all of a sudden, and like Christianity is really weird and it's quirky and there's so many different kinds of it and they're all weird, and Buddhism's weird, and it's not Christianity in particular, but like it those ways of being are so well distributed that we don't see them as awkward in the way that you do. You were just describing your own nascent ways of being and ways of speaking and seeing. And um, so I think part of that first thing that I said is just really privileging um, that someone has something important. And it's just because it's new or unique or different or unusual, or I've not heard of it before, I don't quite understand it yet, doesn't mean it's not worthy of being taken seriously. And so from my own perspective, hearing you say that, I'm like, well, it's not awkward to me. It's just new and different. And that's great, actually. That's where the juice is. And I'm reminded lastly of my friend Zencephalon, who I've had on the podcast, and uh, he's really taken the stand for the word you. And you know that I use you, that when I'm saying the word you right now, I mean this, not the Y word. And um, he's taken that stand for what's important there and how he's seeing that and what he's valuing. And when I heard him say that, it looked weird to me. It did, in fact, look awkward when I first said it. I was like, why are you doing that? But then I asked him and I was like, oh, that's a good answer. And then I practiced it with him in our own messages. I would use you to describe him. And after a few months, I was like, no, this is just better and this is true and this is good. And I would like to adopt this. And it's time for me to adopt this more generally. And so sometimes, in fact, recently someone was triggered by me using you. I like replied you to them and they're like, don't use that or I'll block you. It's funny because it's a sign of respect in my orientation. And they're like, don't respect me. Obviously, that's not what they're saying, but translated to my perspective, that's what they're saying. And anyway, but I think these really, to me, these are about distribution or how well spread they are or how well understood they are rather than an intrinsic awkwardness or something like that.
I appreciate that very much. I think it is a real gift. You're right. And it speaks to a kind of steadiness that um what we don't totally know today is okay, you know, and that's not a prerequisite to being in relation is understanding.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me really appreciate these sort of long-winded, winding conversations because I think there are different kinds of conversations where, a podcast, for example, where people just like get right to something right from the start and it's maybe a shorter form and it's like very fast-paced and juicy and like sizzling. And for me, I really enjoy this like leisurely, like let's just see what's here from a lot of different angles and dimensions. And then it often finds a center towards the end. And that's where the juice is for me. And I think it would be possible to get directly there, but I like this sort of like circling around it from a bunch of directions, where it feels more substantial and more trustworthy. And then my experience is that I walk away with having received something and seeing differently and acting differently. And it takes time to digest that. But then it's so good that these are recorded because I can go back and be, wait, how did she say that? Or what was that exact portion? So anyway, that's all by way of saying I'm very grateful that we had such an extended conversation and could speak about this.
I think it sets us up. Like if we knew each other better, I'm almost afraid we couldn't do it because that longness that comes early and the patience for it creates this exactly that ability to jump vast distances in the future. And so we'll be able to hold together hyper coordinated, massive things, and it won't be available with a context for anyone else. It'll just be something that's super fast and weird, right?
Mm,
Like an insider world. And so, like, it's nice that we get to have this moment before that is really off to the races because it's coming.
I agree. I agree. Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very true and attuned to the shape of conversation and collectivity, really. So demonstrating that you know what you're talking about. I like it. Yeah.
Well,
Mm.
I hope you had a great day and happy Thanksgiving.
Mm. Thank you, Erica. I so enjoyed this conversation.